Fabulous. Hello everyone. Thank you for all for having me. Thanks, Andrews, for a lovely introduction. So yeah, we're going to talk about burdens today, mostly. And firstly, I'm just going to explain what it is that we're going to do in this like little piece of time, what it is that I'm going to try to cover in this lecture, and then I suppose we'll get into it. So a couple of things we're going to do. The first thing is I'm just going to give some caveats about the lecture itself, like what I will or won't be covering. Secondly, I'm just going to give some notes on the choice of case that you have, because I think it's actually really important for the burdens that that case has afterwards to make sure that you get the case right in a way that I'll explain. Then I'm just going to go through like how you identify burdens in an argument, like what it is in an argument that that you need to prove and how you can find out what that is. Then just going through some ideas of once you've identified, well, we need to prove this, how you should go about doing it, especially in instances where you maybe don't have a clear idea of why the thing that you know is true. Like you know that the sky is blue, but you don't know why the sky is blue, how to get to those kind of proofs. And then we'll just do some Q&As. I also have some like tips and tricks at the end if we get to that. So starting off, a couple of caveats. First thing is I'm not like historically, I found burdens of proof very difficult. I found it actually not easy to find where I was or wasn't proving things, what needed to be proven, etc. And oftentimes I would get the feedback like, oh, we thought the case was good, but you just didn't meet this level of proof here and here. And it's something that me and Jack worked on a lot in this season, which means two things. It means firstly that I have some ideas and some kind of weighting this that have worked for me, but might not necessarily work for you. But secondly, it means that there are other different debaters with other different ideas about how to identify burdens of proof. I know that Kat, for example, has a brilliant workshop on it online. And if they have things that are maybe contradictory or different to what I'm saying here, that doesn't mean that those are wrong. It means that, it means that this is a different style that you can also approach because different things work for different people. The second thing then is pretty much the same thing, which is like identifying burdens of proof and then finding out the ways to prove those things is all about heuristics. It's all about like different approaches you can get to the same endpoint, because everyone is trying to find, for the most part, the same kind of proof for the same argument. So depending on person to person, different kinds of things will be more useful. Some people might, be better at a more fluid approach, like something that's kind of more, talkative, discursive with their partner. Some people prefer maybe a more like regimental approach, like having like specific things to be looking out for. So I would recommend that I'll cover both of those kinds of things, but I would recommend that you try a bunch of the different things that I'm going to talk here, see what works for you and go with that. And indeed, if something is working for you right now and it's different to what I have here, stick with that and just try to improve on it. Third thing, just briefly, if I have examples, they'll probably be from debates that I've done. That's not me trying to, be braggadocious or anything like that. It's just that those are the things that I'm most familiar with. So instances of where like these kinds of things work well for me might be the kinds of examples that I'm going to use. So just moving on then, in terms of just general case construction strategy. The first thing then to say is that you should be thinking about your case, like the whole thing, in terms of like what you do in prep time, who speaks first and second, what kind of case you're running, all those kinds of things, not as existing independent of each other, but as a whole collective. And so that's why I have Jose Mourinho here, because I think it's useful to think of it like you think of a different kind of tactical game. Like a manager of a football club doesn't just, get the 11 best players on the club on the pitch and get them to play. They have a specific kind of style. So like, I don't know, like Jurgen Klopp likes high pressing teams. I don't know if this metaphor really lands, but the idea here is that it's useful to think of the whole thing of the case, like the weighing, the proofs, what case you're running, and the burdens within that argument as part of a greater whole, and having a clear idea of where that whole is going to fit into the debate. So that means a couple of things. Basically, it means that firstly, oftentimes it's useful to prove fewer things if you are identifying the thing that's most important to prove. There's going to be instances later in this lecture where I'll explain why that's important. But basically, if you want to fill all your burdens of proof, it actually normally means you need to run fewer arguments. And having an idea about what the most important argument is the way to approach that. Secondly, it means spending more time in the debate, thinking about the difficult things. So here's what I mean here. Oftentimes in prep, we can get into the idea too quickly of maybe spending like a minute coming up with the case, like what it is you want to prove. Maybe there's like 3 or 4 things where you kind of identify as being potential prop arguments, something like that. And then immediately we just go to, okay, what are all the reasons we can think of why this thing is true? That can be useful in some debates, and maybe some people find a lot of success with that. In my experience, however, it's more important to spend time asking the difficult questions. So if an argument you find out 4 minutes into prep is the really important argument, and it takes you 2 or 3 minutes to come up with the proof, that's fine, because as long as you know that that is the most important thing, how you can weigh that to be the most important thing, that's how you're going to win the debate. And thirdly, then it means spending less time doing a lot of different stuff and spending more time doing one thing really well, because oftentimes the reason why a lot of debaters will, get the feedback that, oh, this argument I thought was interesting, but the burdens of proof weren't actually met. And you think, oh, that's really strange. I thought we had 3 reasons for that, or we had a bunch of different reasons why the thing was true. How could it not have been proven? It's often because each individual reason itself wasn't proven. So you don't need to just give the overarching claim and reasons why it might be true, but explaining why those reasons are true. And then that really means that you have to spend a lot of time focusing on those reasons, which means you have to probably do less stuff. So instead of, 4 reasons why a thing is true, giving 1 or 2 reasons and explaining why those reasons are true, spending a lot of time on that. And the example I have here is the World's Octo final. We were in opening opposition. I think it might be it's a slightly off-weighted motion potentially. So take this with a pinch of salt, but we were 0-0 in this motion. We get more houses built. It's the only thing we proved, really. We had some other stuff in deputy that was like some responsive stuff that built a little bit, but pretty much the whole idea of the case is people need houses, we get more houses built. That's like one clear case idea. And when you recognize why that's the most important thing and you can find out the weighting for it, it becomes more easy. This is relevant to burdens because if you have the right idea of the best possible case for your position, what the most important argument could be, everything you say about that argument is going to be relevant and important. So the chances of you saying things that aren't filling your burdens of proof are lower inherently, because by definition of finding the right idea, finding the most important thing to prove, anything you say on that subject is going to be really important. So, if you realize early in a debate that the most important thing in this debate will be proving why it hurts the economy, or maybe, why it's principally illegitimate or something like that. If you can find out why that's the most important case, it means that most of the work has already been done for you, because it means that any reasons you think of for that thing being true are probably going to be, at the burdens. If you think of it like debating is like shooting an arrow at a target, right? Like if you're trying to like hit these mechanisms at the burdens, sometimes you can miss. And it doesn't matter how many arrows you're flying at it, as if you're 15 feet away and you can't hit it. But if you spend the time to walk up towards the target, i.e. finding a better idea of what the most important thing to prove is, the chances of you hitting that target become much higher because you're just on the right track from the outset. So that's something that's really important, even though it doesn't seem like it's to do with burdens. Really, it's important to spend some time coming up with the right idea of what your case is. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that now, because it's not really directly relevant to this workshop, but having some idea of, thinking with your partner, like, what are we good at and what are we bad at? What are the other teams in this debate likely to run? If you know like the judge or what circuit that judge is from, maybe some ideas about that. Like what kinds of arguments are going to be more useful or less useful here in this debate? What is the thing that if we prove will win the debate? Spending some time in prep thinking like that, a couple of minutes on that means that you've really honed down the time left to be maximally efficient in terms of proving your burdens, because you've just isolated those burdens more accurately. So let's get on to those burdens themselves. The first thing that I think is important to note is in any given argument, when you're trying to prove that something is true, it all follows the same structure. That structure is premises and conclusions. The example here is, all elephants are mammals, all mammals are animals, therefore all elephants are animals. That's a true statement because you've proven why something is true. All of it's completely sound. There's nothing in the conclusion that wasn't in the premises. And that's the really important thing. All the things you see in the conclusion of an argument should be in those premises and should be justified. I mean, in this kind of argument, it's pretty intuitive. No one's going to disagree with it. But when you get into more complex arguments, like you would in debates, or more contentious arguments, more controversial arguments, you need to be absolutely certain that nothing that's in the conclusion of your argument isn't present in the premises of those arguments. So here's an example of something where an argument might be valid, but it's not sound. And this means basically that the premises lead to the conclusion, but the premises aren't true, so the conclusion is not true. So all elephants have 100 legs. All animals with 100 legs are insects. All elephants are insects. Like all animals with 100 legs, I think, are insects, unless there's some really weird animals that I don't know of. And if all elephants had 100 legs, then it would be true that all elephants would be insects. But the problem is all elephants do not have 100 legs. So I think there's two things to take note of here, which is firstly, just identifying something like a logical structure from premises to conclusion is not sufficient to prove that an argument is true without justifying why those premises might be true. Obviously, in debates, you're never going to be able to fully prove a premise entirely, but thinking about which one's likely to be contentious, which one teams are likely to disagree with, and fortifying that one is something useful. So in this kind of thing, say you wanted to prove this argument, I wouldn't recommend using this argument in a debate because I don't think it'll be relevant or true. But for the sake of example, say you were running this argument, you might realize pretty early that no one's going to probably disagree with the second premise because it's probably true, and it's probably really hard to disagree with it. But people are going to spend a lot of time disagreeing with the first premise. So you want to spend most of your time focusing on that. And I think that's a really important thing, which is like not just thinking about why your arguments are true, but which of your arguments or which of your premises within an argument are likely to be the ones that teams are going to disagree with, how they're going to disagree with that, how you can preemptively insulate against that. So you have this general structure of an argument. You have the premise one, premise two, conclusion. An example of what this might be in a debate is this policy will lead to inflation. Inflation is bad for people, therefore this policy is bad for people. Now, each of these things in turn might require more justification. So this is where you end up with this these other like Russian dolls that like are smaller dolls inside of each other. I think they're called like Matryoshka dolls. If you look at the first premise of this argument, so this is a full argument, right? This is like something you might have for a case. This is you're in CG in an argument about, I don't know, housing or forgiving student debt or something like that. And you are like, okay, well, we think this is going to lead to inflation. This is our case. You look at each individual premise of it. You're going to want to prove each of its premises. And in those individual premises will be a logical structure in itself. So, for example, in the first premise, this policy will lead to inflation. You then almost start a different thing. You that for a second, you go to a different place and you justify that. So in that argument, you're saying the first claim is this policy will lead to inflation. The reason this happens is because of this and this. What you're doing then is you're saying there's a first premise why this leads to inflation, the second, there's a third premise. Like the reasons why this leads to inflation is itself another form of the same kind of argument with premises and conclusions as well. You do the same thing for the second argument, and that will lead you to your conclusion. So you would also have to spend some time justifying why inflation is bad for people. And of course, the more bad you can make it, the more you can justify that, the more important that is as an argument. So you'll notice something here, which I think is actually really important, which is that weighing and stuff like that and fraying is actually not included here. The reason for that is because we shouldn't think about our framing and our weighing as existing as like outside your case. It's not like you do your framing, you do your case, and then you do your weighing. And obviously, like in your actual speech, it might end up having that kind of structure, but you shouldn't think about it that way. The reason for that is because you aren't operating strategically if you're doing it in that way. If your framing isn't providing a reason why your arguments are true, and if your weighing isn't providing a reason why your arguments are true, they're not helping you win the round. So thinking about it more holistically can kind of help in those ways. And again, this is just like a way of thinking about it. It's not necessarily like there's other ways to think about it that will lead you to finding better things. This is just one way of thinking about it. So thinking about arguments as a whole picture of how the world looks on your side of the house is kind of more useful than thinking about it as like independent blocks of analysis that add up to something. Obviously, that is what you're doing, but it's just a different way to think about it. So with that in mind, if you have that kind of general structure, so like why is your argument true? There's other things that you should add to make your argument a little bit more persuasive. Firstly, these are the kind of things like you can have this written down on a sheet of paper, before the round starts. You have a little post-it note on your desk to remind yourself. or you can just try to be thinking about it in a debate. Firstly, why is this a unique cause of the effect you're discussing? So like, why is it that this policy causes inflation in a way that's maybe more severe, more pernicious? Why is it a specific thing that's causing this? That's not just caused by other things. Now, obviously, and this is important, just because something isn't the only reason why something happens doesn't mean it's bad, right? Like, as in, like, if I kill someone tomorrow, I couldn't defend myself in court by saying, well, other people kill, people too, or other things kill people. It's fine for me to kill that guy because he would have died of climate change in 25 years. That's not inherently a reason why an argument should be untrue, but it's often a strong mitigation to say, well, the thing you're talking about happens in a different ways, so it's not that important. That's the kind of way a team can evade your case. And it's the kind of thing where, in a difficult room, that kind of thing, if a judge hears it, they might think, okay, well, this is how I'm going to base the decision off these things. This team proves that this thing only happens on their side. They've proven that it happens, but not that it happens uniquely. I'll get rid of that team. They lose to OO or whatever. Secondly, which is kind of the flip of this, why this effect can't be mitigated by other policies. Because if you say, say it's a motion about, relieving student loan debt, and you're in CG and you say this policy will lead to a lot of inflation because we have to print much money to do this, and that's really bad for people. CO will probably say, well, here's the ways in which you can, you can mitigate inflation. And this thing is so important that we think that that's fine, even if we get a little bit more inflation on the other side, it's not going to be as much as they claim. And it's really important for people to be able to not have debt, something like that. So explaining within your case why it can't be affected by other policies, why is it going to cause a harm that's really difficult to undermine. Thirdly, why it's not likely to be time sensitive, because again, a likely team would say, well, inflation, it happens, but it goes away over time when governmental policies come in. So it's not that important. Whereas the things that we're talking about exist over the long term. And then fourthly, why is this more important than other potential effects? This means two things. It means firstly, why is your argument, this is just general weighing, right? Like, why is this the important thing? Why, like, it's not just that inflation is bad, but it needs to be comparatively bad, more bad than the other things that teams will be talking about in the debate. And also weighing on the bench, why is this the most important reason why inflation happens? Say if your opening had something on it and you're trying to address it in CG. So, and notably, all these things also function as rebuttal and weighing as other teams, right? So when you're proving your case, you can also use this as direct weighing, right? Like, if you've proven that your thing can't be affected by anything else, it is unique, it is not time sensitive, and it's more important than the other things in the debate, you've now proven that your argument is the most important argument in the debate. So thinking about burdens, even within weighing, thinking about weighing within burdens is useful here. This is oftentimes something that, if you want to be more time efficient, this can be difficult, but it can be really useful. Is something that you can knit into your case. So, for example, if you've provided a reason why this will cause inflation, you should be weighing that reason as having these effects. And this is something I think is really important, because if you say, for example, I can't think of a direct example here, but like, if you prove, one reason why this policy causes inflation, and that reason is something that's really difficult to get rid of, it's something that's, that's sticky, it's hard to undermine. It's a policy that has to stay around for a long time. It's going to continue into the future. If you explain while you're giving that reason, like, also panel, as an aside, that means that this thing is really not time sensitive. It will continue on into the future. You're kind of like integrating your weighing into your argument, because you're providing that clear picture of the world from the offset rather than thinking about it at the end. And that's also really useful, because instead of just tacking on a minute at the end of your speech saying, also our case exists into the long term, so we're more important than the other teams. If you're attaching your weighing at the point of the argument, it just makes the argument more persuasive, because it's showing to the judges that you've met your burden while you're meeting your burden, so they can't, just write it off as something that exists in other spaces. With that being said, anyways, that's basically the idea of how argumentative structure works. You're just looking at, whether your premises lead to your conclusion, justifying those premises, and justifying them in ways that are strategic to the debate that's happening, that are understanding the fact that, the game is a comparative game, and you don't just need to prove that something exists, but is more important than other things. And indeed, trying to think about that structure is something that can be kind of useful, even writing it down on your page. But anyways, I'm going to get onto that in the next section. So that's just kind of basically a preamble about, like, essentially what a burden is. A burden is one of the premises that exists within your case to lead you to the conclusion that this policy should not be supported or should be supported, that we believe this thing or we don't believe it, that we support this thing or oppose this thing or we don't. with that in mind, you now have the probably potentially the more difficult question, which is, okay, well, I know that I need to prove this thing, and I know what the different premises are that lead me to this conclusion. But how do I go about filling those premises? Like, how do I go about justifying them? And this is where this workshop, I think, gets a little bit more person dependent. These are all just like different ways you can think about things that might be useful for you or might not. So again, these are things that I kind of justify. So the previous thing that I talked about there in terms of what a burden is true for everyone, but these are things that will depend on the person. And so it kind of just like, it's both personal preference, but it's also something you should try. And I think something really important here as well is don't just immediately jump to one of these kinds of things or a couple of these kinds of things because you think it's the kind of debater you are. This is kind of a weird aside, but I think it's a really important step, which is don't pigeonhole yourself. Don't necessarily think, well, I'm this kind of debater. I'm good at these arguments. I'm not good at these arguments. Maybe you think of yourself as someone who really needs a lot of like regimental stuff and kind of rules to follow to prove a case. Maybe you think of yourself as someone who's really creative and enjoys exploring things. Don't necessarily think of that as true uncritically. Try out different styles and see which one works for you. For a long time, I thought I was really bad at economics. And me and Jack would oftentimes just not run economics arguments because we just thought, well, we're probably not as good at them as other debaters. We tried them out a few times, worked out really well, and then it ended up being something really useful for us as something we had in our pocket going forward. Now, that's not relative to burdens, but it just as a general kind of tool of debating, trying out a bunch of different things is useful. So anyways, I've stuck on this slide for too long, so I'll move on. So first thing to say, and this is the most basic way to approach proving a burden, but is oftentimes the most useful way, which is most debating, you're looking at something happens and people will respond to it, or institutions will respond to it, or the environment will respond to it, and that response happens in a particular way. You try to prove two things in a debate normally. Try to prove that something happens, that something is important. With the exception of like true principles like you should never lie or you should never kill, because they don't need to prove that something happens. It's normally in the motion. Although indeed you might have to say, for example, in a debate about, maybe if you're going crazy and you're talking about the same debate, like this has to forgive all student debt, you'll say this policy will kill people and we should never kill people. So you still need to have that step of why it is that your policy is true. And that's something that's really important in general for principled arguments, making sure that you prove the thing happens. That means that your principle is true, something really useful. So if you're running an argument like this, violates people's consent, instead of just spending ages proving consent is important, you also need to prove that it does violate their consent. Same in all debates, you're trying to prove something happens and that thing is important. Sometimes that thing will be given to you by the motion. Like if it's this house would kill their brother, you don't have to prove that someone would kill their brother, everyone agrees to it. But in a debate where it's kind of more indirect, you need to make sure that you fulfill that step between the motion and the start of your argument, which is a kind of a space in which a lot of debaters can oftentimes miss, that you need to connect your motion to your argument at the very start to explain why this directly links, and connect it at the end to try and like fit it in like a Tetris piece. So there's three things that you want to ask in general when you try to prove that something happens. You try to prove that the actor in question, whether that's governments, people, whatever, have the incentive to do the thing that you're saying. So say, for example, let me think of a decent example. Say you're trying to say that there'll be backlash from the right wing about something. It's a pretty stock argument. Explaining why they have the incentive to do that kind of thing, like why there'll be backlash. Say, go back to the previous example, this has to forgive all student loan debt. You might say, the right wing doesn't really like these kinds of like socialist policies. A lot of them didn't go to university themselves, so they feel like it's unfair on them because they didn't take out any loans, they didn't take out any risk, but they're still being indirectly punished because it hurts their taxes. There's powerful actors that are trying to incentivize them to do it. So it's not just that they have their own internal incentives, but other people are interacting on them, people are pushing them to do certain things, they're being swayed, yada, 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 right? You're trying to identify like a person, like they have the incentive to do what you're trying to do. Secondly, obviously just capacity, right? Like it's just like, you can't say that in response to relieving student loan debt, Dylan McCarthy will nuke America, because I don't have the nuclear codes yet. So I wouldn't have the capacity to do it. even if I might really want to do it. Just as an editor's note, I do not want to nuke America at the moment. But just to be clear, you're trying to say that some individual person has the means to do the thing that you're trying to say. And this is important, right, as well, because both incentive and capacity will also prove the scale of your argument. The more of an incentive that a person has to do something, the more they will do it. The degree to which they do it will be higher. The more of a capacity they have, the more the effect will be of them doing a particular thing. The third thing, though, which I think is actually crucial, and this is where a lot of people, I think, can mess up, is explaining impetus. It's not just that you believe something and you can do something. It's you need to have a call to action to do that thing. It needs to not just be that you desire something, but that thing will be something you desire so much, or this event will be something that changes your life so much that you will go and do something as a result of it. The great example people give of this pretty frequently, but it's a really good example, is most people believe that climate change is real, and that it's going to cause massively negative harms to them in their lives and to their children's lives. So that's a massive incentive for people to do things, right? It's the total destruction of humanity. Secondly, most people have the capacity to do some change. They could lobby governments, they could vote, they could decrease their consumption, they could not use cars, they could use public transport, etc. Most people have the capacity to make some change here. So you see how incentive and capacity is not sufficient here, because even though most people have the incentive and capacity to do radical climate action, or even just some climate action, most people absolutely do not. They don't do anything. So what you need to do is that final step of why this is something which will call them to action. It will rest them out of their slumber. It will wake them up and make them do something. This is something that's really important in like political debates as well, right? If you're trying to say, this will change how people vote, maybe it might, but a lot of things aren't actually significant issues. So I don't know, you could be in a sports debate about like, I don't know, nationalizing Barcelona or something crazy like that, like the Spanish government should buy Barcelona. And you might say that right wingers in Catalonia probably won't like that this happens, because the Spanish government, they don't like the Spanish government because they're Catalonian, and they might have the capacity to cause some more civil unrest to increase their likelihood of seceding from Spain. But it's unclear why this would be the impetus to do it. And what you need to do there is say, like, this group of people cares specifically about this thing. This is it's kind of like tipping point analysis, right? So that's kind of, I guess, is the basic debate term for it, right? You're trying to prove the specific reason why something happens, as opposed to just a set of values that people have, and why this will fulfill those values alongside their ability to do things as a result of it. Secondly, think about common reasons why things happen. So if you're trying to think, okay, well, I know that I need to incentive capacity and call to action, but why does someone have an incentive? Why does someone have capacity? Well, capacity actually tends to be a little bit easier, right? It's only just an assessment of a group of people, but incentive is something more difficult to pin down sometimes. So having a think of general reasons why people do things, and whether this motion is relevant to one of them, to a group of actors that you're trying to prove does something. So that can be psychological, both individual psychology, kinds of biases people have. It could be protagonist bias, it could be short-term bias, etc. And explaining why that bias exists. Or it could be group psychology, how people act in groups, like Stanford prison experiment stuff. If you put two people on a different side of an aisle, they'll fight against each other, that kind of thing. Having those kinds of biases available to you, or maybe not biases, bias might be too tough a term, but those like psychological reactions, how people react to stimuli. Having a few ideas of those, maybe like looking into it a little bit, doing some research. I say research like Wikipedia. It's also useful as a little tip to, if you're making something up, give it a name. If you're trying to say humans have a bias that they probably don't really have, give it a fancy name, and act like you're confident about it. Just be like, oh, well, humans obviously. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I close that. Humans obviously have plant pot bias, as we all know, and that means this, and this. Like obviously that kind of thing is nonsense, but like if you kind of give a good name to your argument, it's kind of useful there. That's just an aside. It's not really relevant to the rest of the lecture. So those are the irrational reasons why someone will do something. Then thinking about rational reasons, I think a lot of economics debates are like this. I don't know, like inflation goes up, so people's money is worth less tomorrow than it is today, which means they're going to spend a lot of money now, and that's bad. Or I don't know, interest rates go up, so people borrow less, which means you get less people in housing. Those are kind of pretty useful things. questioning whether the actor is likely to be rational and explaining that in your speech is useful. Because if I were responding to someone making a rational argument, this person has this rational incentive to do this and they have the capacity to do it. A really easy response is, well, sure, maybe, but this person, alongside most people, are not rational. And here's the way in which they are irrational. That means they're going to do something differently than what you said. And suddenly your argument seems weaker than it was. So, but if you're preemptively explaining this group of people is likely to be rational in this instance, maybe because they take a lot of time to make this decision, maybe because they have the experience and knowledge of it, maybe because yada, yada, yada. Thirdly, then I think about the values an actor holds. I like, maybe they're conservative, maybe they really care about their family, maybe they care about their community, maybe they don't, maybe they only care about themselves. And think about how that kind of value changes how you respond to something happening in society. It's also true for governments, and it's true for institutions, and it's true for businesses. But like, it's kind of easier to think about it if you think about it like as people. Something really important about that is that doesn't just change whether someone reacts to something. Even it doesn't even always change whether they react to something positively or negatively. But oftentimes it means the way in which they respond to it will be a particular thing. So I don't know. Say you're trying to explain that the student loan debt is really important for left-wing Americans because a lot of them went to college and they'll really enjoy it. And if Joe Biden didn't implement that, then he won't get voted in the next election. It's actually probably useful to say, well, the left wing in America really care about institutions. Historically, a lot of their policy has been based around allowing people access to the vote and being able to vote in elections. That love undermining gerrymandering, that kind of thing. We're really trying to solve that. Therefore, when something bad happens to them, they think the way that they should respond to it is by voting. So maybe that means they vote for people further left. Maybe it means that they're swung to populists. I don't know. Maybe they vote for libertarians. But you're proving there that the way in which an actor thinks it is right to respond to something is the specific thing that you're talking about and nothing else. Because these people think that the response to something is voting, therefore they will respond to this thing by voting. Also, finally, and this is just general debating advice, but it's useful in burdens, don't debate in a vacuum. If you are explaining why something is true and someone has given reasons why it's not true, those two things, if they're just left on their own, it ends up being totally random for the judges. Or maybe if you're speaking CG and they're outwhipped, the one piece of rebuttal the outwhip gives can take out a CG claim, even if it's not very strong, if both teams are just proving something is true in a vacuum. So not only should you be thinking about making sure you prove your case and respond to other cases, but also thinking to yourself as the debate's happening, where is it that my case is targeting theirs? Where does my case prove that their thing isn't true? Because if two teams have, two arguments that are that lead to different conclusions, somewhere in the proofs of those arguments there will be a contradiction against each other. And if your case is true, or if you believe that it's provably true, or that can be proven to be true, then you should be able to find where your case interacts with theirs. Oftentimes that's at the level of, this group of people will hate this or they'll really like this. Or maybe it's, this group of people is more powerful than this group of people, so their reaction will be more important, that kind of thing. So explaining while you're mechanizing your case, while you're proving your case, where your case is interacting with the rest of the debate. And that can be really useful in extension because, you're able to say, well, we think the reason why this leads to inflation is this. Now, I know OG said this, but that falls to the opposition response of this, whereas our claim here has proven that this opposition response is not true, and therefore is more important than the reasons the opening government have given, and therefore it's the most important reason why inflation happens, that kind of thing. Thirdly, this is a different kind of approach you take, is painting a picture. So if you're really struggling to prove your burdens in an argument, and you really just don't know what it is you're trying to prove, you're kind of missing out on things, you're not noticing where things are important or not, what can be useful as an idea to try, it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but I have found it useful in the past sometimes, is thinking about the whole world that your case resides in. So if you're thinking about what a world looks like with this policy versus what a world looks like without this policy, and all the different kinds of effects that exist in that, all the different people that are touched by it, and kind of taking some time to both zoom out and look at how this affects economies, politics, etc., but also zooming in. Something that can be really useful is like thinking about an individual person's life and how they're affected by a policy. can be really useful because it can let you identify things that other teams are missing in terms of burdens. Basically by locating something that might be unintuitive, but it's actually true if you think about the real world. Finding that real underlying thing about the real like organic element of society that means that something is true or false, like kind of like real life perspective. And if you're someone who has had a real life, as most of us have, it could be useful to kind of think of like how would this happen, like how would this motion affect me. Obviously, like not everyone is going to be the most important actor in a debate, but like it kind of gets you in the mindset. So I think like something that's really useful sometimes is to like think from the perspective of someone in the debate. Think, really try to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are affected by a particular emotion and work from there, because that'll let you identify things that no one else was thinking of, because you're actually trying to imagine a perspective rather than just thinking in the abstract. Like if you think about it, like if you've ever done a motion which has been about something that you know a lot about, or is actually something you experience a lot in real life, you oftentimes will find things that no one else was thinking about because it's directly related to your experience. Obviously, you can't always translate that into putting yourself in other people's shoes, because there's a certain element of experience that you can't get just from trying to imagine yourself into it. But you can get some of it. You can start to kind of find that picture of that world. And this obviously takes some time in prep. It takes like a minute or two to kind of think of stuff, but it's really useful if you can get into that kind of mindset. It's something to try anyways. It's kind of a more, maybe if you're someone who's maybe debates more emotively and expressively, this can be a useful way of getting yourself into the thought processes that allow you to prove burdens better, especially if you're struggling to find reasons, if you're extending off a good team, something like that. Fourthly, the thing that this is almost the exact opposite, which is when we're talking about the logical structures of a case, literally write those down on individual sheets of paper. Write down on a sheet of paper, premise 1, this thing, premise 2, this thing, premise 3, if you do 3, this thing, conclusion, this thing. Make sure that all those premises lead to that conclusion, really investigate it. Make sure that this argument fits within the debate, i.e. that the first, second, and third premises are things that are changed by the motion, or maybe one of them significantly changed by the motion, or whatever you will do. And trying to be really, really on the ball about how you're interacting with that. Oftentimes, what's actually useful as well, if you're struggling about impacting, which is kind of a burden that teams can oftentimes miss, like they prove an argument is true, but they kind of don't put the impact of it. Thinking about corollary claims is useful. So a corollary is something that exists alongside a conclusion that itself has its own conclusions. So you might say, like, I don't know, this motion leads to more inflation. If you think of what more inflation means, you've found your impacts. So like more inflation, that means people's money is worth less day to day, which means people's savings are less useful, which means that people that were saving up for holidays or paying their healthcare bills, that kind of thing, suddenly their money is maybe less useful in those instances, and they just need to spend it. It means probably that your currency becomes weaker. So if you're a particular kind of economy, that can be really detrimental. Think about the kinds of people that are affected by that kind of import-export thing. Maybe it's manual laborers, maybe it's the working class, they're the people that will lose their jobs. Thirdly, it means that businesses, yada, yada, yada. So like, try to think of like the effects of what happens because of a conclusion, and then what the like effects of those effects are, if you get what I mean. Like, just like think about how the world changes and then what that means for people within that world. Fifthly and finally, if it helps you, this could be useful. Don't just think of reasons why your argument is true, but reasons why your arguments could be false, and then target those things. So obviously, if you think about it like a plane going in, this is like the famous example, like a plane going into warfare. Like you want to put a lot of armor where the bullets are hitting, right? You want to put a lot of defenses in your argument where they're going to be attacked. And I know that sounds kind of basic and something that we all know, but remembering to actually do it is really important. So kind of building your reasoning around those responses can be kind of useful. That I think is actually really important overall. So that final piece of advice there, which is like, it's kind of like a really strange piece of advice, but I think it's very true. most of us know what we have to do. Most of us know that we need to do this kind of weighing. We need to think about all these kinds of things, etc. The problem is just making sure to be disciplined and actually doing it when you get into prep time, when you get into your debate, when you're writing your extension, etc., and not getting carried away by other things. Now, that's a really difficult thing to build, but it's something that you have to do. So like not just thinking like, okay, I know that I need to be preempting responses, and then just kind of like forgetting to do it, or maybe doing it in like 30 seconds of prep and not really thinking about it. Being actively thinking and kind of like forcing yourself to do the things you need to do to win a debate can be useful. If that's something you want to do. I don't know. Some people maybe find that less fun, and that's a reasonable reason to not do something. But if you are trying to be strategic and win rounds, it's something that's useful. Something that's really important as well. And this is something that I think is. I might actually have it on the next slide, which is the last slide. But if you can weigh your reasons, and this is something that like is a burden that teams should be thinking about. You're in a really good position. So if you not only prove that these 3 reasons lead to this thing that everyone cares about in this debate, it leads to more people dying or more poverty, etc. Not just weighing the impact of that, not just weighing like why people dying, for example, is really bad, because oftentimes teams will agree on that. Maybe they won't in a different debate, and that's where you can choose to spend your time more wisely. But explaining why your reasons, the most important reasons why something happens, is really important. So like, it firstly insulates you against responses of teams saying this, and then, this happens for other reasons, because you've already said, well, okay, it happens for other reasons, but this is the big one. Secondly, I think that, and secondly, it helps you against extensions, which is to say, like, if you, say you give 3 reasons why something is true, and you spend a lot of time framing and doing other justifications, and the team comes in CG and gives 10 reasons why something is true, and the judge goes, well, they give more reasons, they win. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily the best way of judging a round, but it's often the way rounds can be judged, and especially if like if a team is quite good at doing that style of extension, you're weak against it. If you can weigh your reasons while you give them, it means that they not only have to give a bunch of reasons, but individually weigh those reasons against the weight you've already given for your reasons. They just won't have the time to do that. And so you're in a really strong position against your close. So I just noticed the thing in the chat that says, can you show slide 3 again briefly? I presume you mean this one here. I'll just leave it on the screen for a second. Yeah, that's the majority of it. I have one more thing, which is like tips and tricks that I think are useful. But then we'll move on to questions and answers. So just give me a second. Okay, so yeah, some tricks. These aren't like really relevant to this thing, but it's useful anyway. The second one there is the thing I just said. Weighing your reasons is really important. It's a very difficult skill because it's not something most of us are used to. But trying to get in the mindset of like thinking about past rounds and like where you got extended on and beaten, how you could have preemptively weighed against those things is something that can be kind of useful. First thing though, POIs are your friend in a lot of instances. Not always, but often as really useful, particularly if you're extending, or even if you're not extending, early POIs. The reason for that is because before a team has had the chance to craft this perfect POI that like really dismantles the core logic of your case, the first thing they're probably going to ask you is a burden that you haven't hit yet, because they're probably going to think, oh, well, this team didn't prove this. POI, you didn't prove this. That's really useful for you because that you've now found the thing you need to prove. And even if like, even if you don't have anything to think about it on the spot, your partner will have some, or you'll think of something to say normally at the moment. Like if some POIs are saying like, this actor doesn't have the capacity to do this, you say, well, they do, and here's the reasons why. Obviously that kind of off the cuff thing is difficult, but it's something you can do. Second thing then, which is actually the third thing on this list, is looking for holes between the gaps is oftentimes a useful way of calling out other teams on missing their burdens, which is the way you carve open the space for you to have your burdens met. Which is to say, oftentimes teams will debate in kind of really like, almost like economic terms. They're like, well, this group of actors responds to this stimulus in this way for these reasons. But they don't actually think about how real people in the real world respond to things. So if you can think, maybe an extension, maybe in response, how do actual real people interact with something? It's firstly going to be more persuasive because it's more grounded in reality, and so it's better able to fulfill your burdens. But secondly, is a kind of space where not all debaters are exploring. So you have a lot of room to maneuver there, because if everyone else is debating these kind of macro terms, and you're able to say, well, look, they said this will lead to this, but they didn't think about, this person, a real person, and how they interact with this first thing. I think isn't true. You're ending up finding a really useful and interesting strategic space to explore and that kind of thing. Maybe that's all abstract nonsense, but I found it kind of useful. So that's the broad kind of idea of it. Does anyone have any questions? I'll stop the screen share now. I hope that was useful for you. I don't know what it was, but those are just some things that I found useful for myself as a debater. So yeah, thank you all. If anyone has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand, either about specifically the workshop or on the idea of burdens or on debating itself. Yeah, Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, so I do have a question. With a case in example, one of the motions from EEDC was about regretting or opposing globalization of art. What we argued was mainly about the impacts of that globalization from up. And what our closing did was to show how those impacts materialize. So in case of either opposing something, should you focus on proving how those impacts are going to materialize or have materialized, or should you just focus on pointing out those impacts in status quo?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the things where it's dependent on context. I think it's a good question, because a lot of the advice on how to fulfill burdens is very dependent on context. It's very dependent on the round. It's very dependent on the motion itself. So if you think that something is going to be broadly agreed upon, you should not spend a lot of time justifying it. So if you're trying to say that, say in that debate, if you're on up and you're trying to say it locks out minority artists, I mean, it probably does, and that's something that most people would agree is important. Now, maybe Gov will try to weigh it off, but you don't need to spend a huge amount of time doing that. Maybe maybe a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes, explaining the impact of that importance. So like why people's not being able to express themselves or see themselves represented in media is so important, and more important than other things. Particularly, it's something that, like in DLO, you can kind of see where the debate is lying, right? Because in DLO, you can see what like CEO's POI was to OG and where you think that they're going to go in the debate. And you can hear CG's POI to you, where like to like your partner, the leader of the opposition, and where that was going to go. You also see where OG were taking the debate, so you can kind of have an idea there. I think this is a really important deputy thing, because deputy is a really malleable position. You can move into a lot of spaces. You can choose to come out up with a new extension because you think that you've beaten your top half comprehensively, and you're worried about your closing, and you don't think that the diagonal team is going to respond properly. You spend a lot of time weighing because you don't have anything really else to explore, but you know that you can't prove that extension you need to. You can spend a lot of time rebutting because the other good team is the top half team, and you're not sure whether you're winning top half. That kind of thing also applies to how you should be presenting your case in the first place. So what I would say is, specifically in those kinds of debates, where what you're really trying to prove on up is something that government will contest, because government will try to, proposition will say in that debate that there is actually a lot of space for minority artists anyways, and that that space either still exists or gets better, or they will try to prove that that the media itself is good, or maybe it has some like incidental impacts on people. But really, that the first claim is going to be probably the most important thing in terms of their preemption. So spending a lot of time justifying that is likely to be the most important thing. Again, this is where weighing your reasons becomes useful, because if you can, because obviously the detriment that you have in top half, the disadvantage in top half is time, and that's in two senses. Firstly, because you have to do a lot of setup, it means that your ability to spend time on individual points is probably a little bit less. And secondly, you have less time to think about how the debate plays out and finding the most important things, because backup teams, CT and CO, are going to be able to interact with the top half debate. They're going to find that one claim that was missing in one team. They're going to weigh the hell out of it and they'll try one. But the advantage you have, and this is the advantage you absolutely have to seize in top half, is you have the big obvious reasons, the big obvious points that are really important and not necessarily easy to prove, but if proven are really important. So if you can do that, it leaves the space open for you very well at top half, because you can find a couple of reasons why minority artists get locked out or don't get locked out, depending on what side of the house you're on. and weigh those reasons. Or maybe it's not even three, maybe it's one reason, but that one reason is really important. You can, I don't know, in opposition side of the house of that debate, you can say, well, actually this creates an emergent counterculture to the dominant norms, and it means that those like minority groups within non-Western countries were able to find a space to express themselves where previously that had been dominated by the majority hegemony there or something like that. Like that kind of idea is something you can explore there. I don't know if that really answers your question very well, but like the broad answer is like, it depends on what you think the most contentious thing is.
It does answer the question, thank you. I do have another one.
Cool,
so let's take, for example, a motion on lustration in a burdened democracy. On OB, the argument was lustration doesn't necessarily follow the principle of democracy because regardless of who commits any sort of crime, they need a fair and just trial. What Gav was trying to prove was with the connection to the government that was authoritarian, these individuals don't deserve any iota of principles of democracy. How do you break that?
So it depends what position you're in, but this is something that's actually, I think, useful, is like not just thinking about your own arguments as having a particular logical structure, but thinking about other like the rest of the team's arguments as well. So I'm actually gonna open up a Google Docs because I want to show you something that's I actually think really important. That if I can write it out. So I'm gonna open up a screen share now. So 1 second. Okay. Presumably in that debate, the way that people were talking about democracy was using the regular state power principle. That principle looks like this if you write it out. Premise one, the state removes people's, or actually it's people have to follow the state writes laws. Premise two is these laws are enforced with violence. Premise three is so state rights laws are enforced with violence. Violence without consent is wrong. Premise four is democracy allows people to consent to laws. Therefore, the conclusion is democracy is, well, the actual conclusion is democracy is not wrong, but the more simple way is democracy is right, or democracy is good. Now, if you're interacting with that kind of debate, what's really useful is to actually look at the premises and not just like think that the team has proven this thing. So rather being like, okay, they didn't say power principle, let's move on. Look at what's actually being proven here. What's proven here is that violence is bad, which most people would agree with, but people are only subject to violence. So firstly, it's hypothetical violence. And maybe you might be able to say hypothetical violence is less important than real violence and give some weight for that, because the person who, had to obey the speed limit wasn't shot in the head. Even if they had evaded the speed limit and had evaded police capture, they might have eventually been shot in the head. They weren't. So it was hypothetical rather than instantiated. And that opens the room for you to do some practical effects, because you can say that lustration will lead to violence. And sure, maybe it's a form of violence for the state to exist, but it's not necessarily a form of violence for the state to exist that's more significant than like actual physical violence for people on the ground. The second thing that I think is really important is this violence only exists where people are constrained, which is to say, the only circumstances under which this principle is true or has principled effect on people is where someone is forced to follow a law that they would not have agreed to. So, and there's ways to avoid this in response if you're doing the principle, but you can say here, look, the team on whatever side didn't prove to us that the kinds of policies that these people, would implement would have been better. So for example, say for example, if you're the team saying lustration is a good thing, you can say the state power principle makes no mention of who is making the laws. It's just about the laws themselves. So unless this team could prove to us that this group of people would have brought in laws that were different and that people would have preferred, they do not get any impacts. Similarly, you can say even if those laws existed, even if they would have had different laws or different policies, it's unclear to me why that is a meaningfully important form of violence. So say, for example, if lustration meant that you ended up having slightly higher corporation tax than you would have otherwise, it's really difficult to see the connection between corporation tax policy and violence. It's true to an extent that people maybe would have wanted to not pay taxes, and then this marginal increase, it equals more violence, but it's probably true that most people wouldn't want to pay any corporation tax at all. So if they have to pay corporation tax either way, why is it that that form of violence is more meaningful? You see what I mean there? I guess I'll kind of leave the share there. But in general, what I'm saying is looking at the that kind of thing is useful. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, because I think it's more useful to not think of just like specific debates and how things play out, but the general case of how you can interact with that. So the way you would try to break apart that deadlock is by really looking at how the team has proved their argument and whether they've filled their burdens in their argument, and how you can use their own premises to your advantage. Because if they said, they've said like if they said violence without consent is bad, you can say we agree, but we think more of it happens when you allow, like when you don't have illustration because of what it represents to people, etc. So if that helps, that is kind of useful enough. Looking at the two questions in the chat there, yeah, Desmond, I can email you the workshop. I have the Google Slides form, and Ife, I recommend Kat Janssen's workshop if it's still online. I can maybe send a link to that to someone. Apart from that, in terms of materials for proving burdens, it's kind of difficult. I mean, like in theory, the way you would approach it is by looking at like logic of philosophy, but that's not actually very useful in debates. I suppose just thinking about the world, and this sounds crazy, but like thinking about things you see in the world happening and why they happen when you're reading a news article, looking at which things cause that news article to happen. In politics, looking at how people were voting. If you're reading articles, like economist articles or whatever, just like trying to think about how you might apply those to debates and those kinds of things, but also just in general being inquisitive about the world, knowing more about the world, because the way you're going to find those proofs for arguments that no one else was thinking of is not necessarily by watching, that 10th or 11th debate workshop, but it's probably by having real experiences in the world. It's probably by, reading an interesting book that you maybe only use in one debate, but because you've read a bunch of different interesting books, you have a bunch of different things there. I also think I would also recommend looking into sociology as a subject. I think is really useful because not many debaters use sociological proofs. A lot of their proofs are more political and economic or philosophical. But in general, a lot of people don't really think about like how group psychology works and how people interact with one another, the biases they have, how those interact with society writ large. So that's kind of a place that you can explore. Cool. Yeah, Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, my last question is on how do you deal with intuitive arguments? For some motions, immediately you see the motion, it's clear exactly what you want to argue and prove for one side, but for the other side, it's quite difficult. And you know that judges are more likely to buy into the intuitive argument. So when you're on the other side, how do you break that down?
Cool. So the first thing I would say is do not break the fourth wall. And what I mean by that is never say in your speech, look, I know that the other side of the house is probably true in real life, or like, oh, look, maybe their side is, this is a goat-sided motion, but we're going to bring this way anyways. Because the thing that will change the judge's mind in that instance is absolute confidence that what you have to say is completely correct. There's a really good example of this there's like a 2009 World semifinal or something like that, where it's this really controversial motion, and Sheng Wu stands up in Elo and says, never have I been more sure that what I have to say is correct. And it's like, oh, well, where's this going, right? So you kind of like trying to like almost like pre-frame the debate as being more than just meets the eye is kind of useful. Or that's not really like a strategic thing. That's more like a dark arts type thing, but that's kind of the broad idea. But yeah, I would say just in general, like, firstly, questioning those intuitions is something that's useful. Like, just being like, well, even if one side of the house is intuitively true, doesn't mean it's actually true in real life. Being really sharp on burdens there, making sure you prove the hell out of one thing and weigh it really substantially can be useful. Because if you find one absolutely unique thing on your side of the house and prove it, you might not take a first, but you can really easily shoot for the second. Because sometimes those motions will happen, and sometimes motions just are unbalanced. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And firstly, shooting for a strategic second is not always the worst thing. Oftentimes you will actually get a first trying to do it. But like in those intuitive motions, you're actually not necessarily in a bad position, because the teams on the intuitive side, only one of them gets to take the really big arguments. And then on the unintuitive side, it's actually a really difficult space to explore, which means that if you can think of anything strong, you're likely to beat the other team. You've already taken 2 of the 3 points available to you in a debate. You only need to win, 1 round at Worlds to win it if you take a second in every other round, right? So taking seconds is really, really useful. The other thing then is just, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, it's hard to explain, but like, oftentimes you can really get away with a lot of stuff in framing, which is if you can frame out the intuitive thing as being not necessarily connected to this motion, or you can frame out the scale of it. Like I think there's a motion where I tried this and I actually got knocked out, so I don't know if it's brilliant advice, but it was the semi-final of Vienna. Motion was, this house regrets the mass deregulation of the financial sector. We were in CO. We were trying to say, look, regretting the mass deregulation of something, because obviously like that's an example of those things, because in OG they could stand up and say 2008 happened and it was really bad, and everyone's like, well, I guess 2008 was really bad. What we tried to do in CO didn't work in that debate, but it could have worked in a different one. Is say, yeah, like to regret mass deregulation, the kind of factual is not necessarily going to be no deregulation, but there'll be a lot of deregulation anyway. So let's look at how this small change happens. So trying to be creative with your framing can be useful, but also just tackling it head on. I know those are opposite things, but honestly, it kind of depends on context, what the specific motion is. But like trying some new things, trying some smart things, and making sure you prove one thing is useful. Sushant, you have a question?
I think a really great thing that you said that struck with me was that I think we tend to half-ass arguments a lot. Like we just leave it at that, and we just have to force ourselves and discipline ourselves to fill those arguments up. Do you have any tips on how to do that? Because I think a lot of us just blank out at that point and leave it on. We'll be like, hey, I'm going to do it when I speak, and intuitively do it, but we don't end up doing that. So any tips on that?
Yeah, I think so firstly, it's a matter of in prep time trying to find the most important thing. There's like a couple of different ways you can go about doing that, but normally it just involves like thinking for a while in like, think about how it affects different actors. Think like, in any given motion, like, oh, well, is there a feminist extension here? Is there an economics extension here? Is there a political extension here somewhere? That kind of stuff. And once you've found what you think is the most important thing, because if you're looking at a few different kind of arguments in a piece of paper in front of you, and a few different arguments from the other side, like you kind of have a sense of which of them is going to probably, if they're all proved to the same level, be the strongest one. So once you've identified that, that's pretty useful. Obviously, you have to keep in mind whether you think that your opening team will take it if you're in back half, but even then, like it's probably fine, because the upshot of the thing you just described is that top half teams are doing a lot of matter spreading. They're doing the feminist extension that you were going to run in CO. They're also doing the economics, they're also doing the politics, etc. So it means that it's actually still a space available to you. There's very few kinds of extensions you can't run at the moment. It's kind of a useful meta for back half teams, although it's kind of shifting a little bit, right? But like in general, it's kind of a useful time for back half teams. So yeah, just basically what you want to do then is you have a pretty strong idea of what the most important thing is. What you want to think about is just spend some time thinking about the really strong things about that. So the first thing is you've chosen your case for a reason. So that should be the reason you tell the judges is the reason why it's the most important thing. Because if you decided in prep time that this feminist extension was more important than the economics or politics ones, you probably had a reason why you thought that. That's your weighing done. Not necessarily done, but like that gets you in the right mindset for the weighing. Second thing is you want to place your extension. So you want to either, do that kind of direct weighing, but you can also do it alongside it, some like positioning. So like you can say, like standing up an extension, being like, well, Odie did this, O did this, this interacts in this kind of way that leads to this conclusion. Where these cases meet, that like this space here, that's where we're entering the debate. Here's how us entering the debate at this point with this extension is going to beat all these claims here. Like that's kind of a little bit more, I guess, analytical, but it's something that's certainly useful to do. And then just like speaking slower, there's no harm. Like if you have spent your time coming up with quality over quantity, I sound like a real dino here. Like he's like, oh, debating these days. But like if you spend your time coming up with quality over quantity, you don't need to say as much. So it's fine to speak a little bit slower. It's fine to spend some time thinking of a really good example or a really good metaphor, or a really strong introduction or something like that. Like the kind of thing that like makes your case really stick with the judges, that brings you up from, it brings you from that like 82 to an 84, or brings you up from like a 75 to a 79. Like those kinds of like accentuations. And it means doing all the things we said in this workshop, right? So you find out the case, you're also trying to like make sure that the premises lead to the conclusion, that they're all justified. Thinking about how actors in that world that you're painting react to the stimulus that's at hand, react to the policy, thinking about why it is more important than other claims, thinking about any other claims in the debate that implicitly or explicitly say that your claim is not true and responding to them, or explaining how your case does respond to them. Like there's actually a lot of work to be done to prove a given argument, that requires a lot of time to be expended on it. So just noting mostly the things that were said in this workshop as the kinds of like signposts or things to be looking out for are kind of useful in there, I guess. Ruth?
Yeah, this is actually more about you. What do you do when you meet a motion where you're just blank? You don't know anything about it.
Yeah, so it happens sometimes. The first thing is don't panic, because the likelihood is if you're in a motion that you know nothing about, the other teams also probably know nothing about it as well. Like by and large, and even if they sound like they do in the debate, that's probably because they're I think the polite term for it, but that's probably because they're bullshitting, right? So if you can like kind of make sure to not get yourself stuck into the mindset of spending 4 minutes in prep thinking, oh Jesus, I don't know what to do here. Just stop panicking, being like, okay, let's think about this for a bit. First thing you want to do, make sure you're in touch with your partner and make sure you get in common everything you both know, because maybe neither of you feel like you have a strong hold in the debate, but between the two of you, you have enough of an idea of something that there might be a case there, or there might be an extension there. Secondly, thinking of things that you know that are similar to this. So maybe you get a motion about a country you know nothing about. Maybe you get a motion, I don't know, Kyrgyzstan or something. You know very little about it. Think of other countries that are similar to it and what kinds of economies they have, what politics they have. It's likely to be quite similar. Not always, obviously, each country is different, but it's likely to be quite similar. That's the same for all other things. So even if it's like a motion about sports and you know nothing about sports at all, maybe you know stuff about esports, or maybe even you just know stuff about like celebrities and how they interact with each other. Maybe you know stuff about debating. It's like, it's crazy, but like probably if you think through an analogy of sports to like just TV shows and debating put together, you probably get a clearer picture of the world. So yeah, just like trying not to panic, trying to think of things that are similar enough to the question at hand, and also just like making sure that you have that one thing that you can prove and you know is absolutely true is something that's really useful there specifically. So specifically in the context where you know very little about emotion, you're really worried about kind of missing it, making sure you are absolutely sure that the thing you do end up proving is well proven, even if it doesn't seem like the most important thing, is good in and of itself. So say it's a motion about setting up I don't know, like women's esports leagues, and you know nothing about esports at all. You probably know though that if you're on proposition, that it's good to have representation of people. You probably know it's good to have representation of different kinds of people. Then if you think, well, maybe esports is a bit like sports, you might think, okay, well, on an esports team, you probably have players doing different roles, which means that, maybe you get representation for all different kinds of roles, because obviously the other side will say, well, women will make it onto the big teams in conventional esports anyway, so you don't need these other leagues. You could say, aha, but maybe they get stuck onto, you know, because of like how male socialization and patriarchy works, maybe they get put onto specifically, you know, support roles, whereas we get them on more attacking roles, and our side get them on all different kinds of roles that gets better representation, like that kind of thing. So like starting off with the thing being, you know, to be true, and then moving on from there in terms of like how you interact with things. I'll deal with the question in the chat as the last question, and then I'll have to go because I have to go to take a phone call. But the last question is, in debates that are open, what is the best way to convince judges on which specific burdens we need to prove, especially when the other side is most likely to disagree? Is it a good idea in that instance to probably engage the burdens the other side place on you so you do not lose completely? So I think that in a sense, you're trying to do two things, because you're trying to make sure that you have at least something said on everything that your case needs to be true. So you're trying to have something on all the premises. At the same time, you have to prioritize where you're putting your emphasis there. So you have to prioritize the burdens that are most effective, because what you're trying to avoid is, say you're able to, like, you know, we've all had this kind of thing happen before, but like say you're, you know, in emotion and you like deal with all the up responses to why your case is untrue, and you think you've really hammered them home, and you've really prioritized engaging in all the contentious stuff like we talked about in this thing, and then you get the OA and you've taken the third, and you're confused, and it's like, well, the judge says, well, you didn't prove this one thing that's really important for your case, and you're like, well, I didn't think I had to because other teams didn't call me out on it. That doesn't matter, because you need to have a clear view of your case. So it's a balancing act. I know this is maybe the boring answer, but it's true, which is you want to have all your bases covered, especially because you don't know when a team is going to throw a curveball at you and attack your case in somewhere you didn't think it was going to happen at all. So it's a balance of trying to have a little bit of something on all the important burdens, but also specifically prioritizing spending a lot of time where your case is going to be attacked. I think what's useful though is if you think about that kind of thing from the offset of your case construction, and you're only really trying to prove one thing, it means that prioritization is less important, because it means that the three big parts of your case, or the two big parts of your case, are those contentious issues. So everything you say there is going to be important and it's going to be contentious. So you're not wasting time proving something that's not going to be rebutted, but you're also not missing out on a proof of your case by virtue of only engaging with the contentious elements of it. Because what you're trying to do is really like sharpen the sword of your case so that it's only the really important stuff, but at the same time, that really important stuff is all that matters anyway. So it's if you get what I'm saying, it's like it's trying to make sure that your case in the first place isn't something that has controversial elements that teams will disagree with and non-controversial elements that everyone will agree on. It's trying to make sure that the thing you isolated in your case is that really big important football that everyone will be trying to grab as soon as you kicked it into play. Making sure that everyone is responding to your case and they are spending a lot of time on it, because that's when you know that you're winning, right? So when everyone's really targeting you, making sure that you just insulate your case there, defend it well, and position it well in the debate. So like you do your framing and stuff, because no one really responds to framing, so it's really useful to throw in some stuff there. Kind of like picture the world in which your argument takes place. That's the argument. Anything you say there is important anyways, so you don't need to make that trade-off. Obviously, that's the ideal. It's difficult to do it sometimes. In general, though, I would say it's just a bit of a balance. Cool. So thank you all very much for having me. I really enjoyed coming here, and I hope that this was at least a little bit useful for you guys, but I don't know what it was. But yeah, thanks anyways.
Dylan, thank you for having a time with us. We are very, very grateful. The workshop will be recorded and it will be uploaded on YouTube very soon, and would send you your a copy before that. And would I'll take the documents via email and make it available to everyone. So once again, very, very, very grateful, and congratulations on winning the EUDC once more. That was a very great feat. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.